Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing our governor's prediction for the month of June ahead of the 2022 November midterm election. So we'll dive right into it. The states that are already filled out are the states that are going to be safe for either party, a margin of 12 points or higher. Currently the Democrats have 4 safe states, although 1 or 2 might be added depending on the circumstances of the race, and we'll talk more about those in depth. The rest of these red states on the map are going to be safe for the Republican Party. A few interesting states I want to discuss briefly. The state of Iowa and Ohio are both states where the incumbent governors are polling double digits above their opponents, as well as their states that went strongly for Donald Trump back in 2020 relative to how they previously voted for Republicans. Again, these are states that voted for Donald Trump by about 8 or 9 points despite the national environment being in favor of Democrats by about 5. So that's why I've categorized Iowa and Ohio as safe. Also, the state of Texas, Beto O'Rourke currently is not polling tremendously well. In fact, there's only one poll where he's leading, and I kind of question the validity of it a bit since it deviates so much from the average. But nonetheless, Greg Abbott is up, depending on the aggregate you look at, by 10, by 8, or as low as 6. I think given the midterm environment and Abbott's incumbency advantage, he probably will make this a safe race. He probably wins by 12 points or over, which is why I have the state of Texas as safe. Remember, Greg Abbott did extremely well in 2018, despite other statewide Republicans doing quite poorly in comparison. He won with 55.8% of the vote, on the same ballot that Ted Cruz only got about 50.8% of the vote. So a huge overperformance by Greg Abbott there, and I think he's likely to do better than the polls are saying. So now we'll take a look at the rest of the states that aren't safe states. Before we begin though, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and hitting the like button down below if you enjoy this video. I make new videos like this 4 to 5 times a week. I cover political analysis and political commentary. So we'll start off with the state of Oregon and move our way east across the country. Oregon's governor's election will be pretty interesting given the fact that there is going to be 3 major party contenders. You have a Democratic nominee, Republican nominee, and an independent nominee who was more of a moderate to centrist conservative Democrat in the state Senate that ended up running as an independent. So this race really is a pure toss-up in my opinion, because depending on the polls you look at, they're all over the place. We really only have polls from one polling firm for these hypothetical polls, and that's DHM Research, which I honestly know nothing about, and the results are all over the place. You have some polls where the generic Republicans are up by double digits, and you have some where the generic Democrat is up by about 9 points. But the only poll we have with the 3 of these candidates has the Republican nominee, Christine Drazan, at 30%, Tina Kotek at 28%, Betsy Johnson at 19%. So Betsy Johnson really taking a lot of votes away, seemingly from both candidates, but it will probably end up hurting Tina Kotek a bit more. As of right now, I'm going to categorize this as tilt Democrat, but I think this race is going to be extremely close in November, and I wouldn't be surprised if I change this rating in future predictions. Oregon, again, is a state that hasn't voted for a Republican governor since 1982. So it's been an extremely long time since Oregon has ever elected a Republican as their chief executive, even though 2022 is expected to be a good year for the Republican Party. Politics has become a lot more polarized, and even though Oregon governor's races have tended to be pretty close in recent years, I still think the Democrats have a slight edge in Oregon, given how Democratic the state is. Moving on down to Nevada, this was a state that actually shifted a tad bit to the right between 2016 and 2020. The biggest shift towards the right was in Clark County, which I think encompasses about 2/3 of the state's population. It was a state that only voted for Biden by about 2.5 points. And given the fact that the national environment is expected to be at least redder than D+5, I would say about R+4 is a good estimate. I think that this certainly is going to be helpful for the Republicans in Nevada. If we take a look at the polling in the governor's race so far, it seems to be a dead heat between Lombardo and Sisolak. I think the national environment personally will put Lombardo over the top. He's only trailing Steve Sisolak by 2.1%. I think it's going to be a close race nonetheless, but I think Joe Lombardo will probably end up winning this race by about 2 to 3 points, so I'm going to put that as lean Republican. Moving on down to the state of Arizona, this was a Republican stronghold that has been trending more Democrat in recent years. In 2020, it famously voted for Joe Biden, a Democrat for the first time since 1996. So not as long as some of the other states, like Georgia, for instance, their streak of voting Republican, but still pretty impressive nonetheless. But it was one of the closest states in the country. It was the second closest state in the country Joe Biden only winning by 0.3%. And if we take a look at the polling for Arizona, it once again is sort of a pure toss-up, although we really don't know yet who the Republican nominee is. It looks like it's going to be Kari Lake. There's one poll that had her lead challenger, Karen Taylor Robeson, at about 27%. Actually, 23%, only trailing Kari Lake by about 4 points. Now she's at 27 in the latest poll with Kari Lake at 39. So Kari Lake is probably going to be the Republican nominee, although the primaries are in August, so there's still time for things to change. Her vote share has seemed to shrink a tiny bit. Overall, she's at 39, 27, 23% in some of the latest polls. There were earlier polls that had her consistently in the high 20s, mid 30s, and even low 40s. So, as more of these candidates are getting their names out there, Republicans are kind of shopping around for their nominee. But I think Kari Lake is still the favorite. And I think given the national environment, she probably will have an edge in this governor's race. This is an open seat, so Doug Ducey obviously can't run for re-election. But I think as of right now, Arizona is probably going to be in that lean Republican category as well. Probably a similar margin to Nevada, just because Arizona has been trending more to the left. Nevada's been trending more to the right. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Republican nominee only wins by about 2 or 3. And again, we still don't know 100% who the Republican nominee is, but just looking at generic Republican, generic Democrat, I think the Republican wins in Arizona by a couple of points, given the national environment. Moving on over to the state of Colorado, Jared Polis, the incumbent governor, is incredibly popular. He has, I think, about a 58% approval rating across the state. If you look at the ballot for Colorado, there is a Constitution candidate on the ballot, which some will argue in certain statewide races in Colorado, like 2010, like 2014 for the governor's race, they took a significant percentage of the vote away from the Republican and ended up helping the Democratic candidate. And that could very well be the case again. Again, we have the most recent poll with Jared Polis at 50%, the Republican at just 32%, and the Constitution candidate at 5%. Now, it's likely that this is going to be a tough year for Democrats nationwide, but I think Jared Polis on the state level in Colorado will actually be in a pretty comfortable position to win his re-election. I think he wins by a likely margin. I think he'll probably win anywhere between 6 to 9 points. Again, he might get dragged down a bit by Biden, but Jared Polis has done a good job, I think, of distancing himself from the national administration, and I think it will help him in his governor's race. So I think as of right now, he probably wins by about 6 to 9. Again, he's probably going to be helped by this Constitution candidate taking away votes from the Republican nominee, whoever that ends up beating. Looks like it's going to be Heidi Ganahl, but we'll see about that. Moving on down to New Mexico, this is a state that's going to be very competitive in November, I think, which is kind of surprising when you look at New Mexico on the presidential level. It voted for Joe Biden by 10.8%, so many people will be surprised that it's in such a competitive position. But remember, we have a state that also voted for Biden by about 10 points, Virginia, which ended up electing a Republican governor by nearly 2 percentage points. So New Mexico isn't an open race. Michelle Lujan Grisham is running for re-election, but she's one of the most unpopular incumbent governors in the country at the time. And she's also facing re-election in an extremely tough national environment. New Mexico tends to swing pretty wildly in governor's races. We take a look at 2018. She won by a landslide, 57.2% to Steve Pearce's just 42.8%. This is actually, if we go back, the same margin that incumbent Republican governor Susana Martinez won back in 2014. And if we go back to 2010, she won her last election with 53.3% of the vote to 46.5%. And, again, a super wild swing in governor's races in New Mexico. It really depends how much of the vote the Libertarian ends up getting in this race, but I think Mark Ronchetti is an extremely strong candidate. He ran for Senate back in 2020, and he actually overperformed, only losing to the Democratic nominee by about 6.1%, despite Donald Trump losing the state by almost 11%. So already really a perfect storm for the Democrats to be in trouble in New Mexico. Normally I've put this as a lean seat for the Democrats in previous elections. I'm going to make a bold prediction. I actually think this will be a flip for the Republicans, and I stand by this because I was right about New Mexico the last time. What we saw in Virginia, the shifts that we're seeing there, and Michelle Lujan Grisham's unpopularity, I think it's really going to hurt her. The fact that she's only leading by 3.5%, again, these are early polls and things could change, but the fact that she's only leading by such a small margin in a state where she really should be, crushing it in the general election, I think this is going to be a flip. This could change, but as of right now, I think New Mexico is on track to flip very narrowly in the Republican column. Kansas is a state that I think Republicans are almost guaranteed to flip. You know, Kansas is an extremely Republican state. If we take a look back at the 2018 elections, Laura Kelly won this race by about 5 points. And this really was sort of an anomaly in the state of Kansas because as a Democrat, Laura Kelly was able to win the governorship by 5 points, but all of the other down ballot Republicans won by nearly 20 points in their races, 20, 15 points, all incredibly safe margins. And the Attorney General, Derek Schmidt, is the Republican nominee or the presumptive Republican nominee for governor to take on Laura Kelly. Now, she's actually mildly popular for governing a red state, but I don't think that's going to be enough to save her. John Bel Edwards was another super popular governor, still is governor of Louisiana, a Democrat. When he ran in 2019, he only won, I think, by about 2 points or so, despite him having about a 55% approval rating. Laura Kelly's is about the same, and she's going to be running in a really tough year for the Democrats. Again, 2019 wasn't really a good year for Republicans. John Bel Edwards also ran against a pretty lousy candidate, in my opinion, which is one of the reasons why he won re-election. But I think Laura Kelly won't be so lucky this time. Now, if we take a look at the polls for the Kansas governor's race, we really only have a couple to go off of. So as of right now, not a whole lot. But in the last 2 out of 3 polls we have, the only 2 out of 3 polls, and again, these are Republican internals, so there's still a lot of information to come out of Kansas, but Schmidt is leading in the polling average right now. And I think as we get closer to election, the Republican is going to do a lot better. Chris Kobach, the nominee for governor back in 2018, was a really poor choice for Kansas. He was seen as too extreme by a lot of voters. Kansas tends to be more of an establishment Republican sort of state. You know, they voted for Trump by a safe margin. You know, it's a safe Republican state, but they usually prefer slightly more polished candidates for statewide office, and Chris Kobach was definitely to the right of Trump on a number of issues. And ultimately, coupled with the blue wave we saw around the country, Laura Kelly was able to perform an upset here. But I think this time around, she's not going to be as lucky. I think she loses re-election by a likely margin, which again could be anywhere from 6 to 12 points. So we'll see what the exact number is, but I think it's probably going to be in the likely category nonetheless. Moving on up to the state of Minnesota. Minnesota is a state that Republicans oftentimes say that they're going to be able to flip. You know, they tried to flip it in 2016. They didn't really put a whole lot of effort into it. Of course, in 2020, Trump did a lot more campaigning in the state of Minnesota, but it really didn't get him anywhere. He only got 45% of the vote in the state. Joe Biden won the state by 7, a likely margin. If we take a look at the polls for governor, and again, the incumbent governor, Tim Walz, when he ran for the first time back in 2018, he won by about 11 percentage points. So he did extremely well. Minnesota voted to the left of the nation, as it often does. Minnesota, you know, I don't really consider it a Rust Belt state. It's sort of just a Midwestern state. But, you know, the trend we've been seeing in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, really, of, you know, moving to the right in favor of Republicans, it really hasn't happened so much in Minnesota. The rural areas of Minnesota have been trending significantly to the right, but the urban areas have been trending much more to the left to kind of counteract this in a way where Democrats are still winning Minnesota by a couple of points. And if we take a look at the polls for 2022 so far, Tim Walz is actually in a pretty decent position to win re-election. Now, the latest poll, which is a Change Research poll, only has him up by about 2, so the polls are narrowing. But I still think that he has the advantage given the fact that Minnesota is a pretty Democratic state. So I'm going to put this in the lean category for right now. But if you take a look at the polls here, it is getting closer. And I think ultimately, you know, we might see a change in this rating at some point. You know, Scott Jensen, I really don't know much about him. But he seems to be pulling the best out of the other Republicans. So we'll see. But as of right now, I still think Democrats will have an edge in this race just because it is Minnesota. But I could change this rating in the future. So as of right now, I'm still going to keep it in the lean category, but it's subject to change. Moving on over to Wisconsin, Tony Evers, the incumbent governor, only won his last election by about 1.1%. He was running against a Republican incumbent who actually outperformed the Republican nominee for Senate by quite a bit. You know, the Republican in the Senate race only got 44.6% of the vote. He got 48.5%. He was an incumbent governor. I don't think he was that unpopular either, and he did pretty well in the WOW counties of Wisconsin, but he did worse in the rural areas where Evers made up the difference, mostly due to the Democratic backlash of the Trump presidency. So I think as of right now, looking at the polling we're seeing out of Wisconsin, which this is pretty interesting because the polls actually have Evers up by a decent amount. Tim Michels, who's the Trump endorsed candidate, he's currently up by about 7. There's some polls where he's up by about 4 against Rebecca Kleefisch. I don't really buy these early polls. Wisconsin is a state that notoriously has pretty bad polling. I think Evers is probably going to lose, and I'm going to put this in the lean Republican category. I think most voters probably will see him as an ineffective governor since he's been deadlocked by the Republican legislature, hasn't really been able to get a whole lot done. And also, this was one of the closest states back in 2020. Donald Trump only lost this state by 0.6%. That's less than a point, and we're looking at an environment now that's going to be significantly redder than it was in 2020. I think it's more likely than not that Wisconsin flips in November. Moving on down to the state of Illinois. Illinois could have actually had a pretty competitive governor's race, and we're actually going to be talking about Illinois' primary elections. They're also being held in conjunction with New York and Colorado. But if we take a look at the Republican primary polls, Darren Bailey, who is a really interesting character, he's leading by 16 points in the average. He is not the type of person you would think to be running for governor in Illinois. He's got a thick Southern drawl. He's extremely evangelical, extremely conservative. He would not win a general election in the state of Illinois, and so far he's leading the pack for the Republicans. Richard Irving, who, kind of ran sort of a Mark Kirk, Bruce Rauner kind of campaign, pro-choice, pro-gay rights, all of these liberal on social issues type of campaign. He would have been viable in the state of Illinois, but, he fell out of favor with the Republican base. Darren Bailey kind of gained in momentum. J.B. Pritzker and other Democratic groups have actually been pouring money into his candidacy, knowing that he would be DOA in a general election. So I think given the fact that he's likely to be the nominee right now, or Jesse Sullivan, both of these I think can't win a statewide race in Illinois, even given the red wave environment. I'm still going to put this as likely Democrat. I think, it's probably going to be about a 10 to 11 point margin for J.B. Pritzker. It could be closer. Again, New Jersey got extremely close, but that was an off year election. I think, J.B. Pritzker probably wins by about, 10 or 11 points as of right now, if Bailey is the nominee. Moving on over to the state of Michigan, Republicans have done a pretty poor job in getting themselves behind a candidate that can challenge Gretchen Whitmer. First, they had a number of candidates, including the former Republican frontrunner, James Craig, as well as a couple of others who had invalid signatures, basically forged signatures on their petitions to get on the ballot. They were actually removed and disqualified, and then you had another candidate actually arrested. So the Republicans so far have been doing a very poor job of getting a candidate to go up against Whitmer. Now, if we take a look at the polls out of Michigan, we really don't have any good polls. These polls where Gretchen Whitmer is leading by like 30 points are totally ridiculous. I don't know who Target Insight is, but they definitely shouldn't be a polling company. Even in the best case scenario for Democrats, you would not see a margin anything close to this. So I, dismiss that right off the bat. But I think as of right now, I still think Gretchen Whitmer has the advantage. The Republicans really have been doing a poor job of recruiting a candidate against her. So I'm going to put this in the tilt category for Gretchen Whitmer. I think she might hold on barely. She has been trying to distance herself more from Biden. But I certainly think, though, that there's going to be certain issues like the COVID lockdowns that will energize the Republican base behind the nominee. But as of right now, I still think she has the advantage. So that's why I'm going to keep this in the tilt Democratic column. Moving on up to Maine, and we'll go down the eastern seaboard. Paul LePage, the former Republican governor, is running for a third term, a third non-consecutive term. In 2018, I think he wasn't allowed to run because I think he could only run for 2 consecutive terms. So he sat it out. Janet Mills ended up winning the governor's race with 50.9% of the vote. So she ended up beating her Republican opponent by about 7 or 8 points. Now, Maine has a system called ranked choice voting for some of its races. We saw that in the Senate race back in 2020 with Susan Collins. If a candidate didn't get over 50%, then it would go to the second ballot, which would be your second choice for Senate would be marked down. Now, obviously, she overcame that threshold. She got 51% of the vote. But hypothetically, if she had gotten 48% of the vote, you would have seen the second-tier candidates, the people's second choices, end up being factored into the total. We saw this in 2018 in the second congressional district, which is why Bruce Poliquin actually lost to Jared Golden. He actually had more votes during the first round, but because he didn't secure a majority in the second round, he ended up losing to Jared Golden. So I thought that this system was also in place for the governor's race. I was wrong. It was actually struck down, I think, by the courts in Maine, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2020 or 2021. So I was wrong about that. There is no ranked choice voting in Maine, which I think gives Paul LePage a decent advantage. Again, he was a type of candidate who benefited a lot from winning by pluralities. Back in 2014, he won by about 5 points almost. And again, he never secured 50%. And back in 2010, he won an extremely, crazy race with about 4 candidates on the ballot. Sean Moody, I think, actually, if I'm not mistaken, that seems like the name of the Republican nominee for 2018. But you have basically a 3-way race between a Republican, an independent, and a Democrat. Ultimately, Paul LePage came out on top by, winning by, only about 1.5 points or so. So going ahead to 2022, I think the fact that there's a plurality system in this race will actually help him. Of course, there is also a third-party challenger as well as an independent. Janet Mills, the incumbent Democrat, on average, is only polling ahead by about 3.5%. Naturally, things can change, but given the environment, I actually think we could see a flip in Maine. I think I'll put it as a tilt flip for the Republican Party. I think it's very possible. She's not an extremely popular governor, but she's not exactly unpopular either. Maine is a state that has been trending slightly towards the right, but not in the way that the Rust Belt was. Of course, Maine is also a state that splits its ticket. I think Susan Collins' endorsement of Paul LePage actually does sort of make a difference with some independent and swing voters, but I think, given the partisanship of the country, most Democrats are going to vote for a Democratic governor, and most Republicans are going to vote for the Republican nominee for governor. Now, Paul LePage has wide name recognition. He's a 2-term governor of Maine. He was actually somewhat popular until the end of his term, in which his popularity sort of took a dip. But I think as of right now, Janet Mills is in a pretty weak position. And again, you'll notice that with a lot of Democratic incumbents, they're not really in strong positions to win their reelection. The national environment is terrible for the Democrats. If we just take a look, I should have brought this up earlier, Joe Biden's approval rating on FiveThirtyEight, which is one of the more generous sites for Joe Biden, which is why I cite it, because, people will often say that the other sites are skewed more towards the right. So even some of the most left-wing polls aggregated has Joe Biden's approval rating at just 39%, which is abysmal going into a midterm election. That's worse than Obama's, I believe, going into 2010. And, if this track continues, and I think it's very possible that it does, Roe v. Wade was overturned yesterday. I think among a lot of Democratic voters, there's going to be a perception that Joe Biden could be doing a lot more about that issue than he is. And while I'm not discounting that a lot of Democrats will be energized to vote in the midterms, I don't think it's going to be enough to counter Republican enthusiasm. Again, I'll probably make maybe another video on this. I did cover the abortion issue a couple months ago when we had the SCOTUS leaks, but most people don't vote on the issue of abortion, which is why I don't think it's going to be a major factor in the midterms. If you're on Twitter or these other sites, you'd think it was the biggest issue in the world. But most voters by November are going to be voting with their wallets, as they usually do in midterms. And I think ultimately it's going to bode poorly for Biden and the Democrats. So I think a flip in Maine is extremely possible. And, again, some of these ratings are subject to change, but this is the way I see it as of right now in June. Moving on down to the state of Connecticut. Connecticut, despite being a really blue state, has pretty competitive governor's races. We saw even in 2018, which was a blue wave year around the rest of the country, the Republican Bob Stefanowski was able to get 46% of the vote, Ned Lamont only beating him by 3.2% in a safe Democratic state. This was a state that voted for Biden just 2 years later by almost 20 percentage points. But this was really due to the unpopularity of the former Democratic governor, Dan Malloy, or at this point, the incumbent Democratic governor. Had Dan Malloy been on the ballot, he likely would have lost, actually. I think Bob Stefanowski was a pretty strong candidate to run for office. More of a business-minded Republican, more on the socially liberal side, similar to the Charlie Baker types, although I'd say he's slightly to the right of Charlie Baker, more like a Larry Hogan, I guess, in Connecticut. Very friendly in the suburbs. And if you take a look at some of the municipalities where he did very well, it was these suburban municipalities here. These are very wealthy suburbs that also on the Senate level voted Democratic by a pretty wide margin. So if we take a look at the polls for Connecticut, and again, polls aren't really a large indicator of how a race is going to go. They give us a window, but I think it's only a tool and not necessarily a total forecast as to how a race is actually going to go. Currently, Ned Lamont has a +10 advantage in the polls. Now, the polls do seem to be narrowing. Obviously, I think Lamont still has an advantage. He's not as unpopular as Dan Malloy. In fact, his popularity is pretty decent. But I think the red wave environment is going to hurt him quite a bit. Nonetheless, I still put this race as lean Democrat. I think Bob Stefanowski is a strong candidate. He's not really a national Republican. He's much more centrist on a number of issues, particularly social issues. And that's why I think this race is going to be a lot more competitive than it otherwise would if you had a Trump Republican running. Moving on over to Rhode Island. The only reason I talk about Rhode Island is because there's a pretty interesting situation going on. Gina Raimondo, who was the incumbent Democratic governor, took a position in the Biden administration as the United States Secretary of Commerce. As a result, her lieutenant governor, Dan McKay, took over. He's not exactly that popular. If we look at Democratic primary polling, it's almost all of these polls are within the margin of error. He's not even guaranteed a full term or a renomination as governor. So right off the bat, I think that makes him a fairly weak candidate. Now, this is Rhode Island. Rhode Island has overall, between 2008 and 2020, trended more and more Republican. Again, even in 2018, you're not seeing crazy margins for the Democrats. That's mostly because you have independents taking up a large share of the vote. But if we take a look at 2020, for instance, this was a state that, you know, back in 2012, 2008, Republicans were only getting like 34% of the vote, 35% of the vote at most, maybe. Donald Trump was able to get 38% of the vote. This is slightly less than he got back in 2016. But nonetheless, Rhode Island, particularly these more rural municipalities along the western part of the state, has been trending more to the right. You know, given where we are, I don't really know if we have any real general election polling out of Rhode Island. We don't really have anything. There's a lot of candidates. You have a moderate candidate, a bunch of independents running. Rhode Island tends to be really weird in that, you know, you have a lot of people running in their races. The Democrat typically tends to be hurt by that, as most of the Republicans get behind the Republican nominee. 2018, it was Alan Fung, who's running for the 2nd Congressional District. I still think this is a likely Democratic state when it's all said and done, but I think you could see sort of an interesting margin, especially if McKay is the nominee, because he doesn't really seem to be incredibly popular among his own party, and I think that's going to hurt him come the general election. Moving on down to Pennsylvania, this is going to be one of the most watched governor's races in the country. You have Josh Shapiro, the incumbent attorney general, challenging Doug Mastriano, who is a state senator from Gettysburg. If we take a look at the general election polling for this race, it's not as solid as you would think. You know, a lot of people were saying, and, you know, myself included, I thought this race would be more lopsided for Shapiro early on, and then Mastriano would kind of get closer in the polls. But the polls that we have, and again, these really aren't good polls out of Pennsylvania. In some cases, they're oversampling Democrats, and early polls aren't always reliable. But Doug Mastriano is only down at most by 4 points in these polls. You know, this is not something the Democrats, especially Josh Shapiro, was expecting. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why he propped up Doug Mastriano in the primary election. He thought he would be the easiest to beat, and I actually made a video covering this about a week or so ago about how there's a number of races where Democrats have been trying to intervene in Republican primaries. Now, looking at this race, you know, they said the same thing about Donald Trump. You know, Hillary Clinton propped up Donald Trump in the Republican primary back in 2016. You know, with the WikiLeaks, we saw the emails where a lot of her strategists were saying that he would be the best candidate to run against, and we know how that turned out. You know, Hillary Clinton lost that race, and Josh Shapiro is not really in a strong position, especially given the fact that these polls seem to oversample Democrats, and they're early on polls which you'd think favor the Democrats, especially in a Rust Belt state that traditionally votes Democratic overall, you know, in statewide races like state auditor, treasurer, things like that, attorney general. And, you know, Doug Mastriano is at a big cash disadvantage. You know, Josh Shapiro has all the money, all the funding, all the endorsements from all these organizations, Democrats, progressive groups. Doug Mastriano only has, you know, Trump's endorsement and a couple of other Republican figures. That's really it. And yet he's still able to make this race extremely competitive because he is very popular with the base of the Republican Party. Tom Wolf, who in his last election won by a landslide against a pretty poor nominee for governor. Scott Wagner said a number of things that got him in a lot of trouble during this race, coupled with the blue wave year and Tom Wolf's like 60% approval rating. He won by a pretty solid amount. Tom Wolf is not in that position anymore. In fact, his approval rating is barely above water, and depending on the poll you look at, is even underwater. So Tom Wolf has lost a lot of ground in the state of Pennsylvania. This race is going to be extremely competitive. I think Doug Mastriano at this point has a slight edge in all of the polls that we've seen so far. And again, these aren't great polls, but there's one thing that stands out, and that's he's overperforming Dr. Oz in the Senate race. And I think if that trend continues, he's certainly going to do a lot better than Oz and probably win by a larger margin than Dr. Oz this November. I'm still going to put it as tilt, though. I think this race is going to be really close. I think the polls might get a bit more lopsided given the Roe v. Wade news, considering that Doug Mastriano is unapologetically pro-life, and he's made that a big part of his primary campaign. We'll see how he navigates that in the general. But nonetheless, I still think he beats Josh Shapiro at this point in time. Moving on down to the state of Maryland. This is another state that the primary, I think, really will determine how the race actually goes. We talked a little bit about this in Illinois as well. Obviously, if Irving was the nominee for the Republicans, it'd be a lot more competitive than it is now. Maryland, it's the same situation. You have Kelly Schultz, who is basically a Larry Hogan type Republican. She's been endorsed by Larry Hogan. She's more economically focused. You know, she is definitely the more electable candidate. And, you know, a lot of people will come at me and say, you know, you shouldn't be focusing so much on electability when determining these races, but you have to consider that electability is a huge factor in blue states for Republicans. We saw that with Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. Had Amanda Chase been the nominee, Terry McAuliffe would currently be the governor of that state right now. And, you know, if Larry Hogan wasn't the nominee back in 2014 and you had a Tea Party Republican, for instance, that seat would have went blue as well. So it really does depend on candidate quality and electability in these blue states. And I think somebody like Dan Cox, who is a delegate in the Virginia House of Delegates, the Maryland House of Delegates. He's much more right-wing on the cultural issues, things like that, which really don't play well in a state that's extremely Democratic like Maryland. Again, Maryland was one of the most Democratic states back in 2020, and yet if Larry Hogan was able to run for a third term, I certainly think he would win it. And he's more of a Reagan-style Republican, or at least that's how he bills himself. You know, sort of liberal on the social issues, but focuses a lot on crime, economics, and taxes and things like that. And he's been reelected by a wide margin in a blue wave year back in 2018. He won by a safe margin in a safe blue state. So, you know, if Kelly Schultz is the nominee, I think it's a lot more competitive, but I still think the Democrats have the upper hand. The last poll we have has Schultz up in the primary. She has a lot more cash than Dan Cox does. So I can't really say for certain who's going to win the nomination as of right now. Dan Cox has a lot of the hard MAGA support, the base support. But Kelly Schultz has the support of the governor and more establishment figures in the Republican Party. So it's kind of up in the air. I might do a compromise prediction right now and just put it as likely Democrat because, you know, if Cox is the nominee, it's going to be safe. If Schultz is the nominee, I think it's lean just because I think it's Maryland. Democrats still have a big advantage, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised. Kelly Schultz is really the only one that can win, but I think as of right now, Democrats are still in a strong position to take back Maryland. Moving on down to the state of Georgia. Georgia was one of the closer governor's races back in 2018. We saw Brian Kemp only beat Stacey Abrams by 1.4%, which, given how other states swung further to the left than Georgia, was a pretty impressive performance for Kemp. Now, Stacey Abrams had a lot of energy back then. She was all the talk back in 2020, 2021 with the presidential election and the Georgia runoffs, but she's sort of fallen off since then in the polls, mainly because the environment has turned so hostile towards Democrats. And if we take a look at the polls in Georgia, there's not a single poll against Brian Kemp where she's leading. The highest she's getting is 47%. Brian Kemp in the last 4 polls is polling above 50%. So I think as of right now, this is certainly going to be a lean for Republicans. I think it will be closer than people think. I think if the polls have Brian Kemp up 5 or 6, you might see a 3 or 4 point margin, just because Georgia as a whole is trending overall to the left by an astounding degree, especially in these suburbs. But I still think you're going to have establishment, moderate sort of, centrist Republicans that maybe voted for Republicans in the past voted for Joe Biden might vote for somebody like Brian Kemp based on the fact that, you know, he was perceived by the left and, you know, independents as standing up to Trump during the election stuff. But ultimately, I think most of his support is just going to come from the Republican base coming home and uniting around it. Because at the end of the day, as much as some of the further right Republicans wanted David Perdue over Brian Kemp, they'll probably get behind him to defeat Stacey Abrams, seeing her as more of the ideological opposite as opposed to somebody like Kemp. So I think that's going to be a lean margin for the Republicans. Finally, going on down to Florida, not a lot to talk about here other than we've gotten some pretty bad polls lately, and bad polls as in not accurate polls. The political matrix polls are really the only polls where we have, for some reason, Charlie Crist up by massive margins. You know, they contradict the average quite a bit. The average still has DeSantis up by about 8 points. Against Nikki Fried, he's up by about 13. And these same matrix polls that you have, you know, Crist winning by landslide margins, Nikki Fried is tied with somebody like Ron DeSantis. So I think these polls really don't mean anything. They contradict the average. Same with the Fabrizio Lee's polls. They're not really reliable either. DeSantis is still up by a large margin in the average. Florida's a state that's trending to the right. I think this is a likely win for DeSantis. I wouldn't be surprised if he wins by about 8 to 10 points. But I think Florida is not really a state Republicans need to worry about in 2022. So that's it for my June prediction. So far, the Republicans have 32 governorships, the Democrats 18. Again, there's a couple of states like Oregon, like Maine, like Michigan that are a little bit iffy, and might change in future months depending on the way we see the polls going. But as of right now, this is the way I see the governor's races landing in November. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like down below. If you haven't subscribed already and you made it this far in the video, please consider subscribing down below. It really helps out the channel and helps me make more videos like these. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.